Hello and welcome to DataCast Solutions Introduction to KNIME for the Data Analyst. In this chapter we're going to cover one of the far less documented and explained elements of KNIME, which is the built-in report writer. KNIME uses BERT as part of Eclipse for its platform, and the report writer itself, they pretty much rely on the BERT documentation instead of creating their own, obviously. And the BERT documentation is not strong. So having a few demos is actually going to be very helpful. So in this class, we're going to demonstrate two reports, one fairly simple and one fairly complex, to give you an idea of how you can use BERT. Now, for purposes of this demo, I've created a number of different data files that I'm going to use in various reports together. But for now, I'm going to focus on this simple sample database I have, a movie rental database. And I want to create a report from it. So it's got the customer number, whether they're active or not, their first name, their last name, the store that they rented it from, the movie that they rented, the date they rented it, and the return date. Now I could do a bunch of computations in KNIME and how long did they keep the movie, and I could filter rows to say I only want to see active customers or only want to see store 3. It doesn't matter. The whole point is I've done an expression here, for example, to say if the active indicator is equal to 1, set it to yes, otherwise set it to no. But the final output, the node we put it to, is data to report. And if I show you the configuration of that node, there isn't anything really to configure. All I want to be able to do here is pass this data and make it available to BERT. So that is step one. I've created a bunch of these. So we're going to create, like I said, many different versions of this. But now that I have data in a report, the name that you give it down here, in this case I called it the movie rental database. The name that you give it in the comment is going to be the name that you see it available inside of BERT as the report writer. So give it some meaningful names when you choose the data to report node. So to launch the actual report, now that I've got this data and I want to create a report, I'm going to zoom up here, and this is going to open up the report writer associated with this workflow and make it available for editing. So I'll go ahead and click that, and we've now got the report writer. All right, let's go ahead and take a look at the report writer itself. And let's begin by looking in the upper left-hand corner. You can see that in the report writer, it's still left the KNIME Explorer open to you. So it's not really anything I'm going to be covering that might show you how to work with different reports from crossing workflows. But especially when you're dealing with calling workflows, that is available. The version right here, however, the dataset name, you'll see it's the movie rental. It's the first line of the dataset name that I gave it. These are all the datasets that are available to me for this report. As I move a little farther down, I can work with individual pointers, which is almost always what I'm doing. I'm clicking on individual objects. Or I can work with selection areas, so I can select large groups of objects, for example, to change colors and fonts and things like that. Down here are all the report items that I can place. I can place charts, text, label, data, tables, and I'm going to cover some of the basics here to how to put some of these up. And the quick tools is configurable. You're going to use the most common is the aggregation tool. You're going to use this to place summary totals and grand totals and things of that into this report. Now, along here, you've got inside the main area, this is the editor for the report. This is what your report is going to look like. And you've got the properties of this report. So on the report tab, I can put in the author and the orientation that I want to follow. If I've got anything I want to cover, where the path is from, I can put comments and a description. Many of these, like I said, are capabilities that are built into BERT that I myself am unfamiliar with. I use the principal KNIME extensions that I need to create my reports out of my KNIME workflows, and that's it. So this is my basic report. This is the format of the layout. So next we're going to take a look at how we're going to work with this to create our first report. Now, hopefully you'll recall at this point that that the concept of a grid can have grids within grids within grids. And that's very useful in how you're going to be building up these reports. So you're going to see me doing some of that to build up sections or areas of my report page. So to begin with, the first thing I want to define on my report is a header. So I'm going to take a grid and I'm going to drag it up onto the canvas, and I'm going to tell it I want 3 columns and 2 rows. And that's going to be my first grid. Now that is a table. Now I can insert objects into this table. I can insert data, flow variables, tables, reports. So let's have some fun and actually start by taking an image. So I'm going to take an image and I'm going to drag it up to the first square here. And I'm going to enter an embedded image, and I've got one set up here that I used, which is a movie. Now, oh yikes, way too big. So I'm going to take this, it made my table. I'm going to make it much, much smaller and say I just want a little bit of an icon up here. That's my corporate logo or whatever I want to add. Okay. And now I want to take some text and I'm going to place it over here onto this side. And I'm gonna make this HTML text, so I'm going to say it's bold and italics, and in here I'm going to call it Datacast Solutions Movie Rental Report. So I basically built up, I've got a header filled up in here. I could continue, I built a second line in the grid so I'd have a space essentially in between. So the next thing I want to do is actually just drag a table full of data. Now the easiest way for me to do this right now is to grab my movie rental database and just drag it over here onto the platform and choose the columns. Okay, I want the customer ID, their first name, their last name, the title they rented, the dates. So that's what I want to bring onto my report. And now you can see it's again created a table. As I hover over here, this is the header. This is what it's going to look like on each header line. This is the detail record. When you see it encompassed by brackets, that represents a data field. This is a constant. This is a data field. And down here would be the footer if I wanted to have a footer for anything. So I have enough right now to go ahead and say I can execute this report. So up here, I usually just click View the Report in BERT mode. If you want, you can view it as an HTML, a PDF, a PowerPoint presentation. You can export it to XLS, whatever you want to do. But generally, I just click the View Report in BERT, and we're going to see it as an HTML screen. So let's see what the report looks like right now as it exists. It brings up BERT, and there I've got my header, and everything's good, except it's really just showing me I haven't controlled the order, I haven't controlled anything about this. And so the next step as I close this out is going to be to say, now what can we do to this report to sort it by customer, to do some totaling and things like that. So that's our next step. So let's take this report as we have it right now, and let's go ahead and I want to sort this by customer. And at the end of each customer, I want a count of how many movies that they've rented. So I'm going to need an aggregation. So I'm going to click here to accent the table, and I'm going to right click over my table here, and I'm basically going to say I want to insert a group. And I'm going to give the group a name. And let's say this name is customer ID. And what's the column that I'm going to be grouping on is customer ID. Now I can insert page breaks and things like this associated with it, but I don't need to do that. So I'm going to click OK. And now you'll see, so here's my detail line. But here is an aggregate header for group, the custom ID group, and a footer for the custom ID group. Now, where you want to put the aggregate is totally up to you. It doesn't make any difference. I'm going to go ahead and put some text into the aggregates footer line. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and again do some HTML, and I'm going to say total movies rented. And now take the aggregation here, and I'm going to drag this up under the first column in here. And what do I want to do? I want to actually, am I doing an average? I just want to do a count. And which field I count on really doesn't matter at this point. I can count on the first name, last name, the movie title. It doesn't matter. It's counting rows in essence and grouping by customer ID. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK. So let's go ahead and take a look at what our report looks like now when we view it. So now I've got the customer ID and I get total movies rented at the bottom. So for each customer, I can now see how many movies each person has rented. Now the last thing I don't like about this is, see, I've got customer ID, first name, last name. They're never going to change. The only thing that changes is the movie title. So the last change I'm going to do here is I want to take this information at the customer ID level and say, you know what? I want to move first name and last name up into the header. See, this is the group header. And the title will be at the bottom. And I don't need the customer ID there at all. So now, looking within this grid, let's see how it presents itself now. Now I just get customer ID with Mary, and then all of the titles that they've rented and the rental dates. So I'm getting a little bit better control over how I want this report to look. Finally, the last thing I want to do is I want to put some control over some of the colors, just to give you a sense again. So within, as I highlight the table, you can come down here within the table and start to specify things like the border, the margins, the background colors, for example. So I could turn around and say the background color, instead of auto, I want to be aqua for my table. I can choose to do this at the row level instead of for the table level. But I can change fonts and say I don't like the whole thing. I want this all to be Arial. Just basic Arial becomes the font I want to see it in. I can turn around again if I highlight a row. Now I can turn around and say I want the header row. That's the only one I want to be aqua. Okay. And those column names, the text, I want it to be Arial, but instead of black, I would prefer that was red and bold. And instead of centered, I want them all left justified on top. So I mean, you're in control of all of this. There's a great deal of information like this built into BERT. And now I'll go ahead and display one more time. So there's my basic report. And you can see I have the ability to go page after page. I can go on to page 2. I've got 402 pages here. And my report, I can also again turn around and say I can create a PDF out of this report instead. If that's the way you need to distribute this information, you need to send it out to executives, not through BERT, then here's the PDF version of my report. So you got, again, a great deal of control over this. I can, by the way, I can change the footings here and everything else. This is all built into the template. But you can see basically it's very easy to generate reports out of KNIME. The next step I think I'd like to do for this report would be to add a little bit of graphic to it to try to punch this up. So I'm going to close the report sample here now. And I'm going to save my workflow. It's actually already saved, I'm sorry. And so now I want to add some additional information that will allow me to do some charts that might be interesting for me to see. So I've decided let's add one more example to our report. Instead of having a chart at the top that shows the entire company, what if we were to put a pie chart for each individual customer and show them how many movies by category that they've done? So to accomplish this, I've actually altered my data file a little bit. I added a simple attribute called rental count, and it's just hard-coded as 1. And I'm going to use this so that I can sum rental counts by category. So it's just a constant value of 1 on every record that represents the fact that they did a rental. And then I'm going to sum that by category within customer ID. So that's the premise for the report. So let's go into our report and verify again originally how it looks without, and we've just got each customer here. But down here under total movies rented, I want to go ahead and add that chart now. So I'm going to take the chart and drag it next to the aggregation. And just like we did last time, I'm going to tell it it's a pie chart in 2 dimensions. And that looks good, so I'll go up to the selecting the data. And I want to use the data from the movie rental. And I'm going to score this across category. And now this column rental count 1, I'm going to drag that up here, and the function I'm going to perform is sum. I think I'm just going to change it to average. I don't want the average. I want the sum. So I'm counting every one of your movie types by category. Now I'll change a couple of my chart titles here and say this is customer category breakdown. And I want to see the series labels so I can see how many they've done of each one of these. And everything else I think is looking good. I'm going to actually remove the series. I don't need to have series 1 as a title there like that. So that looks good, and I'll click finish. My chart is formatted, but I've still missed one important step. Right now there's no filter here, so this chart is going to create the same answer, which is going to be a summary of every single record. What I want is to limit this chart. I want to apply a filter for it so that this chart only shows me the customer ID that I'm currently showing the summary record for. So I'm going to go back in here and edit this one more time. And on the selected data tab, I'm going to click on filters. And I'm going to add a filter to this chart. And what I want to tell it to do is to say the customer ID is equal to, now I could just type it in here, but I'm going to show you how I would go about building it, because what I want to relate it to is the outer rows custom ID. So I'm going to select a value from, I'm going to build the expression here from the column bindings that are available. So in this case, it's a column binding of the table, and it's customer ID. So you see it's the row.outer customer ID is the filter now that it's created for me. That's important, because now I'm only going to see the chart for my individual record. And I want to make this chart maybe just a little bigger so they can actually see it. All right, now I think we're all set, so let's go ahead and preview this report. Now, unlike the last chart where you only had to produce one chart and then all the data, this time I need to produce 600 charts, one for each customer. So this is going to take a little longer. I plan on this taking 20-30 seconds before it's going to come back with an answer. And keep that in mind if you decide you're going to run a chart for 1 million records, this thing is going to spin for hours and hours. So now what I get here is, now you can see here's Mary Smith, and this is a breakdown of categories of all the types of movies that she has rented. And then I'll move on to the next person, Patricia Johnson, and I can see what she likes. And as I scroll through each one of these people, I get this breakdown and say, all right, I can spot trends and look through them and say, you know, I'm noticing that when it comes to Elizabeth Brown, she's very big on the classics and she likes animation. And when I start to think, I can now start to pick and target movie offers to this person based on what I'm seeing in the trends that they're actually developing. So again, this is just another way of using a chart as part of the detail of my summary. So now I want to recreate a report that I've done previously. I have a table profiler, a report I like a great deal because what I do is I read in the contents of any table and then I produce a picture, in essence, of what that table looks like in terms of values, uniqueness, constants of data, etc. So I'm going to show you what I've done for my sample. I'm not going to focus on all the work I did to look at the different patterns and unique values. That's another topic. So I've just got here 3 tables that are going to make up this report that I'm going to use. The first is the table name. So I've got the table that was being referenced, the number of rows, and the number of columns in it. Then I've got the column details. What these are is for each column, its data type and its index. And if it's numeric, I contain the upper and lower bounds. So I've got some long and some doubles down here. So I compute the upper and lower bounds for each of these values when they're present. And then finally, the individual column properties. What I've done is I've taken the most common values for each one of them. So here's a column name which is called, phone country code. And the most common values in my data for phone country code are this, as well as a count of them. And then I also created another property type I called a pattern. And what it represents is I retook the value and I replaced all of the capital letters with capital X and all of the small letters with a small x. So it allows me to see the individual values. For example, look at small island developing states. The common values are yes and no, which means the most common patterns are capital X, small x, and capital X, small x. So I'm using patterns because it helps me spot things. The other thing I do in patterns, I put numerics in for all 9s to replace numbers. I'm looking for bad data, special characters, numerics where there shouldn't be numbers, like in a city name, things like that. So I use these values as part of this report. So these 3 columns together, I've now got 3 tables that are going to go into a single report. So we're going to create a report now with these 3 values, or these three data tables. All right, let's go ahead, now that we know the data that's here, let's go ahead and go into the report designer for BERT, and it knows that all of this information has been altered and we want to refresh it. Tell it that these are now the tables that are available to me. And so we're going to construct this in sections. Okay, so let's start by actually putting a grid up into our chart. Okay, and I'm going to want to put I'm going to want 2 rows, and I think I'm going to want about 6 columns in here because I'm going to want to do something fairly special here. So I want to take this and maybe I'll drag this grid down a little bit here by inserting a text label right up front ahead of it all. Okay, and this text label is going to be my table profiling report. And by the way, that's way too small. I want this to be like 18, and I want the color to be black, but I'd like it to be bolded and centered. All right, so here's my table profiling report. So now I've got some data here about, so I'm going to take the column, and this is going to basically bind it to this grid. I'm going to take the table name and I'm going to drop it in here. And I'm going to take the number of rows and drop it in here, and I'm going to take the number of columns and drop it in here. And I'll go ahead and I can put labels in here. I can say that I want to put a label here, and it's table name. And then I'll drag the label here, and it can be number of rows. And then I'm going to drag a label here, and this is going to be number of columns. So I've got the foundations now of a report. If I want to just for start, just view this as it is right now. Okay, this is the table name I'm referencing. It has 252 rows and 86 columns, and I've got nothing else in the report, but I've got my basic header all built up. And so now I want to build up one row for each of the columns that make up my data. So now we're going to turn around lastly and we're going to add one row for every column that's in our table. So to begin with, that's the column details table. So I'm going to drag this out, and all I want for now is the column name and the column type. And I'm only bringing out column type. I actually don't want a header here. But what I do want to do is insert a grouping column. And I'm going to group on column type. So I want the numbers to come first and then the strings and so on. So column type is the grouping column for this. And now that I've got column type up here as part of the group, I really don't need it here as part of the data. So I'm going to delete it from there. Now I need to actually put some column properties on here. And I'm going to put multiple tables for each column name. I want some data behind it. So what I'm going to do is create a grid within the column name. And I want 2 columns and 2 rows in this grid. And on the first line, I'm going to use constants. So this is going to be common values. And then I'll take another label and drag it over here and say this is common patterns. All right. Now I'm going to build an actual report. So I'm going to take the column properties and I'm going to drag it in here. Now, I don't need the column name and type in the vet, but I need them for part of my filtering, but I don't need them in the actual report. So I'm going to drag them out initially, and then I'm going to remove them. What it's done is it's created the bindings so that I can use them in my where clause and filter. I don't need a header for it. They're self-explanatory, and I don't need a footer. It's also self-explanatory. So I just want to show the common values. Let's remind ourselves really quickly what this looks like. We have pattern, which shows me all the common patterns. We have basic, which shows me all of the unique counts, non-unique, duplicates, and so on. And then column values. Generally, that's only applicable to strings, but it does apply here to some numbers anyway. So let's go back here and say on this report right here for this table, I'm on the filters tab. I want to add a filter here that says I only want records where the property type is equal to common values. And like in all 3 examples, I've also always got to add and where the column name is equal to, build the expression. Now we got 2 tables now, the outer table, the table we're working on right now, the inner table, and the outer table. We want the outer table. We want to match and say where the column name here is equal to the column name from the row outside this table. There's my filter. Okay. So now I've got my common values. I'm going to take the properties table again, and I'm going to drag it out here for patterns. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to select the same 4 columns, and I'm going to remove the first 2 columns so that I can use them in my filter. Delete the header and the footer. And now all I want to do again, you see that's getting a little tight and hard to see. So on this one, all I want to do now is do my filter again. This time, I'm looking for a property type that's equal to pattern. That was the data value I had. And, of course, where the column name is equal to the column name from the outer table, so that I'm only seeing those columns. All right, so now every column is going to show me all the common values and all the common patterns in that data. So the last thing I want to add to this is a chart. I want to see a pie chart of all those basic values, uniqueness, non-uniqueness, duplicates, and so on. So I'm going to go ahead and create a chart, drag it up in here, and again, this one's going to be a pie chart. And for the data, I'm not taking the column details, I'm taking the column properties. And see, it's this property type of basic. So I want to take the property name and I want to sum that against the property values. But I want to filter only the rows where property type is equal to basic. So again, I'm adding my filter where property type equal to basic. And of course, we also have to add, and column name is equal to the table column name from the outer table. All right, that looks good. I finish. And now I think I'm ready to go ahead and display my chart. So I'm going to go ahead and view the report. And now you'll see it begins with the data type of double and shows latitude, and all latitudes are unique, so there are no common values. Otherwise I'd see a count of, like in this case, population percent change. 26 of them had 0 change, 14 had 1.3, 11. So you're seeing the most common values within it, and then the most common patterns within those values, as well as, of course, the number for each column, the number of duplicates, uniques, non-uniques, and so on. So again, just a useful little chart. I find it very helpful for profiling data that I haven't seen and understand before, and it certainly gives you a nice good introduction to what you can do with the KNIME reporter when you get used to the idea of putting tables within tables within tables, and making use of grids to build these things out. There's really quite a bit you can do with this to make some fascinating reports and visualizations. This concludes this chapter of the class. Feel free to move on to the next chapter.